2 weeks. You can prescribe the antidepressants and it's considered ethical. God damn it. Every negative emotion has a flip side, and it has something to do with things, something you value, something you care about. I will say people have no idea what's coming. The establishment. We want to kill the DSM. Friends, let me just say something. Your effect sizes aren't going up. Billions upon billions upon billions of dollars are being spent. And whatever they say, catch what they say and say, well, why is it like that? And whatever else they say, I bet you within 3 questions you're going to hear the word evolution, which are these made-up disorders that even children are learning to, I have this and I have this and I have this and I have that. I'm not saying that it doesn't matter. I'm not saying that what people are calling depression, or people are calling panic disorder, or what people are calling trauma is not important. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying.
Today's guest is Stephen Hayes, the founder of acceptance and commitment therapy and also of process-based therapy, together with Stefan Hofmann. And we'll be talking about both, about ACT and PBT, but mainly the focus will be on process-based therapy. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. And after the podcast, I will be trying to sum up some of the key ideas of process-based therapy and also give you like a list of potential change processes which they list in their book, and also on the, I think, 19 treatment kernels which are like therapeutic methods to try to target those processes. And I think that's going to be interesting for many people. But yeah, so now have fun with my conversation with Stephen Hayes. All right, so Stephen Hayes, welcome to the Painting Onions podcast. Thanks so much for taking your time.
I'm looking forward to the conversations. Thanks for reaching out.
Okay, so you are famous for being the inventor of acceptance and commitment therapy. And there are many great resources online, on YouTube and elsewhere, where people can really get to the depth of it. So today I would like to speak mainly on or about process-based therapy, which is kind of your new approach to therapy, which you have been developing with Stefan Hofmann. But I still think it's interesting for people to get a little bit to know about ACT. So I mean, it's interesting in itself, and maybe it will come up later again in the conversation about PBT. So my first question is, so could you maybe give a little overview on ACT, and also how and why it's different from traditional CBT, cognitive behavior therapy?
Okay, well, ACT is 40 years old. The first ACT workshop was 40 years ago. And it's part of an attempt to try to dig down to the smallest set of processes. What I mean by processes are just things that you can do mentally, emotionally, behaviorally, that produce positive outcomes in the forms of being able to live a more meaningful life. And so we've spent a lot of time in the ACT work trying not to come up with a treatment for a disorder. We never bought into that, really. We did those studies. There's 1,000 randomized trials on ACT. And a lot of them are on syndromes, because that's the way people insist that we talk about mental suffering. But we never believed it. It was never really what we were trying to do. We were trying to figure out what is the smallest set of processes that do the most things to help promote human prosperity and alleviate the problems people have. And because of that, it has a quality. It didn't really go in the same way that traditional evidence-based therapy did of here's this, what about depression, or what about, you can find really nice studies on ACT for playing tennis or chess or running a business or having relationships or dealing with diabetes or anything. Not because it's like one little technique will apply to anything, but the attempt was try to find a small set of processes that do the most things. Initially, CBT was that. I mean, the CBT came from behavior therapy. Behavior therapy was that. It was taking behavioral principles, psychological principles, and apply them to human complexity. But what you think of as CBT really is kind of what happened when big funded trials focused on syndrome started happening, which was in the 80s. Mostly it started in the US with the National Institute on Mental Health. And there was a model became very, very popular of that we need to detect and challenge and dispute and change our cognitions, because our cognitions and their underlying schemas are causing emotional and behavioral patterns that are fit depression, anxiety, etc. So because ACT started earlier, it's more out of the behavioral wing, and because it had this broad purpose from the beginning and was willing to really do the work with processes, it ends up being part of the tradition, but really feeling kind of different. So if you had to just cut to the chase and say, well, what would it look different if I did traditional CBT versus ACT? Traditional CBT would probably, I mean, it's changing a lot nowadays, but it would probably focus on problems and cognitive errors that you have, and you need to clean that up and think more rationally. And when you do, you'll feel better. And when you feel better, you'll do better, and things will move forward. You need to change your thinking pattern. ACT is going to say, your thinking is probably part of a problem, but you don't necessarily need to change it. In fact, focusing on it sometimes actually makes it worse. What we need to change is the impact that it has and the role that it plays in your life. But that's true of your emotions too, and it's true of your attentional processes and your sense of self. And all of that should be harnessed to your values. Why care about any of it unless it lands there, and lining up your behavior with that. So ACT looks more experiential, it looks broader, it's more process focused, and it's contextual. We're not trying to change the content as much as we're trying to change the context so that things work differently. Can I just use an example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
All right. So if you have a thought like, deep down, there's something wrong with me. Suppose I say to you, oh man, that's irrational. You're using a self-evaluation for a whole person. You need to change that. You need to not think that way. You need to think differently. And when you do, okay, but wait a minute. The meta message is there. The person says, there's something wrong with me. And the person says, yeah, there is. You're thinking wrong. Think differently. Okay. How am I going to do that? Well, notice when you're thinking differently, when you're thinking negatively about yourself, and change it. Well, one thing, now your attention is focused there. You think it's going to be easier to access a thought about how there's something wrong with you, or harder? It's going to be easier. Your therapist is telling you to focus on it. And you're really close to something that no CBT person really wants, but happens. You're really close to thought suppression. If I ask you right now to not think of purple mushroom,
Happened.
you're done. You're done. What are you thinking of? Even if you can do it and you can do it for a few minutes, now you're walking around down the hall and suddenly you're thinking of freaking person mushrooms. You never even thought of purple mushrooms in your life. Well, thank you very much, psychologists. Well, that'll happen naturally if you start thinking about, let's say you have the thoughts, I'm unlovable. Yeah, you'll start listing the reasons why. Then your mind will start giving you all the reasons why that's not true. I mean, even 4-year-olds understand the cartoon character with horns on one shoulder, the cartoon character with a halo on the other. You've been doing that your whole life, at least since 4 or 5 years old. And so now you got this fight in your head, and meanwhile, things are going on, and you're focused on what's going on inside your head. So, and I don't want to make fun of my friends. I'm part of the CBT tradition, kinda, but I would say that the bottom line is that ACT can do as well as traditional CBT, and it applies so broadly to so many things, and we know the processes, that increasingly mainstream CBT is looking more and more and more ACT-y. It's mindfulness, acceptance, values.
Yeah.
Doesn't look like you're a CBT circa 1974.
Yeah, I'm actually in training for becoming a CBT therapist, and we
Oh
do
yeah.
have workshops, seminars on acceptance, mindfulness, schema therapy, etc. And I actually wanted to ask you as well, do you think it's not doing justice to act and so on if we just, have a seminar like an add-on, like one technique for some diffusion or acceptance techniques, or do you welcome it and yeah, think it's a good thing?
Well, it's good to have a range of techniques. I think it's probably good to be eclectic in the sense that you should know a lot of things. It's good, though, to have clear philosophical assumptions that don't narrow you. Why? Because you need to maintain a certain amount of coherence in your thinking. If you're just grabbing at things like you might if you're trying to, use all the leftovers from the last week and make a stew, you can make a kind of nasty tasting stew, and that can happen in therapy too. How? Well, okay, I'll say, yeah, we should work on diffusion, but those cognitions really are not quite right. I mean, after all, if you test it, blah, 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 well, you
Yeah.
kind of got a mixed message there. Back up and notice your thoughts, focus on what's important, get your feet moving, and focus on your thoughts and change them so that you can do that. If it's necessary, not, take something like reappraisal, thinking differently. Well, thinking differently in the form of back up and notice your thoughts. Now, what other kind of thoughts could you have? I'm perfectly down with that.
Mm-hmm.
There's no inconsistency there. And it turns out if you do mediational studies of reappraisal, in other words, you really look at the functionally important pathway of change that's produced by classical reappraisal techniques,
Mm-hmm.
it produces the separation from your thought. Beck called it distancing. The first name for ACT was comprehensive distancing. It's not against Beck. I was just saying maybe that's a really, really, really important thing. Maybe we should just do that and then build on that. But also being able to think in a flexible, fluid, and voluntary way of many different things. And then how about if we just take what's useful and leave the rest? Well, that's kind of a diffusion kind of thing. So when you look at what mediates reappraisal, it's cognitive flexibility and diffusion. Those are the two biggest processes
Mm-hmm.
in classical CBT. Well, if you know that, well, then don't do that next thing. It's falling away anyway, but it's still in the textbooks. And you know that because you've seen it in some of your lectures if you're getting trained in this, teaching the person how to think differently and, and substitute an irrational cognition for one that's rational, or one that has a cognitive error to one that doesn't have a cognitive error. Boy, you're getting close to don't think that. I mean, you're really, and look at the failures in CBT when it happens. I mean, all approaches have failures. Often they happen because that client slid over into reappraisal, meaning suppression,
Mm-hmm.
meaning a
Yeah.
fight, meaning beating up on the bad thought. And
Yeah.
inside it was things that were self-contradictory, like the one I mentioned. If you have to change your thoughts to be okay, well, there's something wrong with you now. And here you got somebody with a thought like there's something wrong with me.
Mm.
Maybe that's not the best place to start.
Yeah. Maybe we can later get back to the example when we get,
Yeah.
get to process-based therapy with what's the treatment method, what's the process, what's and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Okay, so yeah, like I said, people really have to check out podcasts, for example, or read your books about ACT because there's so much to say, and you have like six main processes, which we don't have to talk about. But like I said, it's really interesting. But maybe we can focus on acceptance as one of those processes of ACT, because I have a little follow-up question there. For example, when I tell people about ACT, they assume that acceptance is kind of like situational acceptance or accepting circumstances. And then they say often something like, yeah, well, you can criticize that because it seems to be like resignation. So could you maybe talk about this point? Because I think it's really important because many people, even Maybe others who are in training for becoming a CBT therapist think acceptance is just about that.
Well, yeah, and if it is, it's not going to be helpful. If you measure resignation, tolerance, things like that, tolerance is a little bit helpful. Resignation is not helpful at all. I mean, there's lots of studies on it. There's entire measures of acceptance, mostly there before the ACT folks came along, because we meant something a little different. And you can show that they correlate with health outcomes, basically not at all or negatively. Some of them emerged out of studies that were linked to Eastern ideas, Confucianism, things like that, that really do have a kind of a resignation piece in the philosophical underpinnings that go back 1,000 years and so forth. That's not, so I don't ever tell people you have to accept it. I don't even use the word acceptance because acceptance is very easily misunderstood. But the etymology of the word is helpful. In English, that septary part of the word acceptance means to receive is just to receive a gift. And it's still in English. When you give somebody a precious gift, you will sometimes say, here, will you accept this? You certainly don't mean, will you tolerate the diamond ring? Will you resign yourself to my grandmother's, jewelry? I mean, no, you mean this is so precious that I don't want to just give it to you. I want you to willingly take it in. And I'm asking you that not as a test or something, but because it's that important. And I want that acknowledgement. I want that connection that this is something that is precious that I'm offering. Will you accept it? So I don't know if it's the same thing in the different language communities I'm talking to, but my guess is probably so. And that's really what's meant by acceptance and ACT. It's to receive the gift that's offered of your history and the reactions it produces that serve you as a guide in life, remind you of the history that you've had, orient you to how that history shows up in the present, and some of the things that you might do at this moment. So let me use an example. 2 months and 5 days ago, my brother died. I was lucky enough, I heard coming back from a conference in New York when I landed in Denver that he'd gone into the hospital. I was lucky enough to get there where he was still conscious, and he'd walked into the hospital that morning and with a bellyache, and turned out soon went into a septic crisis, had to have emergency surgery, had what's called a enterosusception. His colon had collapsed on itself. We didn't find out until weeks later he had massively metastasized in colon cancer, which he didn't know he had. And then I got a call. It looked like he'd gotten to the operation. I got a call about 3 a.m. It's going badly. I rushed to his side. And, had my hands on him as he took his last breath. His wife of 38 years decided, after multiple crash cart kinds of things, starting the heart again and all that kind of stuff, that he wouldn't want this, and that the surgeon and the doctors were saying there's nothing else we can do. And they pulled the tubes, and we stood there by his bedside as he took his last breath. It took 10 minutes. It's sad for me to say this, yeah, but it's with me a lot. I went to a basketball game just a couple of days ago. He and I went to our Wolfpack, Nevada Wolfpack. He taught at the same university where I taught. And it was a fantastic game, and it came back and it was double overtime, and we beat a ranked opponent in basketball, ranked number 25 in the country. We beat him by 3 points. I kept having waves of sadness watching the basketball game. I would cheer and then turn and see my wife and see the 2 empty chairs of my brother and his widow who were not there. She hasn't yet. She knows how painful it would be to come back to basketball games, and she's not yet coming. I would say that basketball game is more meaningful to me, deeply meaningful to me, even though I'm screaming my head off, but also feeling waves of sadness and tearing up. Is have I subtracted something from my life? Have I diminished my well-being? Should I be on antidepressants? This is how stupid our modern culture is. You know, after 2 weeks, you can prescribe the antidepressants and it's considered ethical. God damn it. How is that allowed? How is that what we've produced in the modern world, that we've become so inhuman, so sick in our evidence-based methods that we can think that when you've lost your spouse of 38 years or your brother of 74 years, that it's somehow negative now 2 months later to be tearing up during a basketball game. So here's what I'd say. No to tolerance, no to resignation. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how to be whole and free with a mind that will remind you of loss and betrayal and mistakes and errors that you've had in your past, and worries for your children and what's going to happen with immigration and with the climate change and with racism and with the modern world and the rise of authoritarianism and all the other things that will extend you out from the present moment into the past and future, and at any time and any place will allow you to contact the most painful things that have happened in your life if something in the present moment brings them to mind. Now, I do understand that we want to be able to regulate in the sense of being able to focus on what's important and leave the rest, but not leave the rest by subtraction. I will never in my life be in a position where there's no possibility of me tearing up over my brother's death. That will never happen again. I'm not depressed at all. It's just another face of the love that I have for my brother. So I think the evidence-based therapies have to get over this biomedicalization of human suffering that so easily tells people, lies to people, that a healthy life is one that doesn't have negative emotions, doesn't have negative thoughts, doesn't have negative memories, doesn't have worries. It's a lie. It's all a lie. And I'm not saying that it doesn't matter. I'm not saying that what people are calling depression or people calling panic disorder or people are calling trauma is not important. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying let's create a space where you can be whole and your emotions aren't your own enemy. And so acceptance is that, to receive the gift that's offered. And I would say tearing up at the basketball game was a gift that was offered because it reminded me of the joyful times I've had with my brother watching basketball as I was doing this joyful thing of watching my beloved Wolfpack beat a ranked team in double overtime. And do I wish he was there to see it? Yeah, I really do. Does that make sense?
First of all, thanks for sharing this
I'm sorry for that long
story.
rant.
No, absolutely no.
I'm sorry for slapping the table, but gosh darn it.
Yeah, and I really I feel your anger, and I like understand. I'm also kind of fed up with the analogy of like as if the like mental disorders or diagnoses would be some kind of medical disorders which you have to fix, or problems you have to fix, and you are as a person wrong if you have some problems or negative emotions or difficulties, and it's part of life. And as you say, and you often say also, like you have, maybe you can explain it with a sheet of paper. I think on the one side you write something like love, etc., and on the other side, of course, loss and all that negative emotions, they go hand in hand. And
They go hand in hand. Every negative emotion has a flip side, and it has something to do with things, something you value, something you care about. So, that doesn't mean wallowing. It doesn't, and so be careful with the word acceptance. If you wanted some words that are safer to use with clients, self-kindness, self-compassion, openness to your own experience. You can use words like that for somebody who doesn't know anything about ACT. That's probably safe. I wouldn't use the word acceptance. And there's some populations, oh my goodness, like people who have chronic pain syndrome or something, they've been used as an epithet almost to shut up talking about your pain. I don't want to hear about it, because people are so, it's not that they don't love their loved ones, but they just don't know what to do about the chronic pain. And so you just have to accept it gets used as a synonym for please don't talk about it.
Yeah, right. And then it's also the kind of the opposite then. Yeah. Um, I actually I wrote an exam in my, I think, master or bachelor of psychology, and on ACT. And since then, I really had like almost like an epiphany, like acceptance being such a new and different path to all this, like suffering, mental disorders, etc., and promising freedom or liberation, or as your book is called, a liberated mind, which is standing there in the background, which I have here too. So yeah, I can just encourage people to get into it more and more deeply, and not stay at the surface.
Yeah, and for my colleagues, be careful about just reading superficially. Come to a workshop or get a self-help book that challenges you to look at your own stuff. Don't start with just the words, and because you so easily can come up with cartoon versions of ACT that a good training, a good course, a good actual experiential workshop. And it's not because it's a cult. Nobody's going to ask you to get a tattoo. You don't have to swear an oath. There's not 5 levels of training. We've done all that we can to pull down all that horizontal nonsense that many evidence-based therapies immediately go to, certifications of levels. And we actually have our trainers swear they will not certify people. And if they insist on it, we cast them out. You're going to have to do that elsewhere, because this isn't about hierarchy and about tithing to founders and all the craziness. This is about processes that make a difference. And it's based on the psychology of the normal. And with due respect to the other traditions, I said ACT is 40 years old, but most people don't know about it before 20 years ago. Because the first 20 years were all about developing the underlying basic science and philosophy of science and measures and components, and giving talks to 5 people. I mean, it was nobody knew or cared about ACT. And then it became a thing, and now it's worldwide. And there's 1,000 randomized trials and 400 meta-analyses and all this. But if you're interested in it, be interested enough to dive in deeply enough and apply it to yourself in such a way that you can get what we're trying to get to. And you can criticize it and change it and all of that. You can rename it. We don't care about any of that kind of stuff. But we want you to get in touch with what it's really about. And the PBT effort is really an effort to carry some of the first 20 years into the current environment, but now modified by what we've learned. The first 20 years meaning, what would it be like if we really focused on processes first? And what would it be like if we made sure that they applied in this ideographic way? And nowadays, with where Stefan Hofmann, myself, Joe Sorochi, and others are taking it, we're taking it rapidly into what would it be like if we let go of the ergodic error that's inside randomized trials, mediation analyses, psychometrics, IQ testing, and all the rest that comes from Galton and his eugenic dreams. That the whole model of science that we've been applying, we believe, is flawed. And some of the goes back to the early part of the journey with this weird part of psychology called behavior analysis that I came out of, that most people think is dead, and mostly, the only thing they would know is Skinner thinks the mind is not important, which is really, really the wrong idea. So I'm nowadays really trying to take the meta about what we've been doing at ACT. We call it contextual behavioral science. I mean, how did we even get here? And then carry it forward in a way that it's not about ACT qua ACT, and not even about behavior analysis, not about any one little tradition, but taking some of what was important in the ACT journey and putting it into evidence-based, I'll say therapy, but it's really intervention, because it could be positive psychology. It could be, with people, trying to be Olympic athletes or whatever. It isn't just about mental health, and certainly not what we call disorders.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, it's good that you already started talking about, or like getting into process-based therapy, because I also wanted to ask like how the idea evolved, and maybe also what your role was and what Stefan Hofmann role was, etc. It would be very
Yeah.
interesting to just get to know.
Well, it's been a partnership between Stefan and I, and increasingly others. Joe Sorochi came in pretty early on, and there's quite a crew now. I mean, there's scores of people doing PBT work, and it's hardly really gotten started. It's just you can see it coming over the horizon. And I will say people have no idea what's coming, and I do. And if I'm given 10 years or so and the mind that I can still use, it's going to be a fun adventure for me. And I'm pretty convinced it's going to go on. Stefan and I were kind of at loggerheads. We were almost enemies in a way, not personal enemies, but he was, an early defender of the flag when ACT arrived in the form of the so-called third wave of the behavioral and cognitive tradition. And it looked like, uh, the the wild people were at the gates, and it arrived suddenly, even though ACT had been around for a long time. But as I say, it was such a small part of CBT and behavior therapy and so forth that hardly everybody really was tracking it. I mean, somehow or another, I was nominated to become president of the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapy. And so I guess I was well enough known for things like that to happen. But if you made the list of CBT procedures, very often ACT wouldn't even be on the list, would not be mentioned. But what happened is that a popular book that I'd written, the first general purpose popular book on ACT, or trade book, for just normal people, called Get Out of Your Mind into Your Life, was written up in Time magazine. And the late John Cloud, the reporter, became a friend later, who wrote that story, wrote it as a war between me and Tim Beck.
Oh, Tim Beck, okay.
Well, it was never a war. I mean, the first ACT study ever done that was a randomized trial was done with the help of Tim Beck nearby the Center for Cognitive Therapy in Philadelphia, because he helped us find a place to do it. And I'd sent him my very first PhD. I'm going to finish my career here in 6 months. I'm about to retire from the University of Nevada, Reno, with 57 PhDs, but the very first I sent to be trained by Tim Beck, before everybody knew, like, Tim Beck. So it wasn't even an APA approved internship. I had him cobble together an internship for my student, to go there as kind of a fellow of the Center for Cognitive Therapy. So, and he's a very gracious, he's dead now, of course, but a friend and a very gracious person. And he said, this is not cognitive therapy, but it's worth testing. And we did a randomized trial comparing cognitive therapy with Rob Zettel, my first student, trained by Tim Beck, so he knows how to do it, and ACT, trained by me. At the time, it was called comprehensive distancing. We hadn't even come up with ACT as a name yet, and ACT did a little better. So, but it was a very small study. It was, but when it was written up by John Cloud, he wrote it as a war. And the Time photographers came out and took a picture of me on my motorcycle, for example, which produced red eye. You know what red eye happens? Which is easy to eliminate after the photo is taken.
But not this time.
Photographer knows how to do it.
Yeah.
They left it in. So it has me on my motorcycle with red eye in Time magazine, right? With the caption saying, "The Rebels." Okay. And then you had Tim Beck with a bow tie.
Yeah, I think I know this one.
And the caption underneath it said, "The Establishment."
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, it sold a lot of magazines. It was a brilliantly written story. It was so much fun. You know, John followed me for 6 months to my workshops and stuff like that back in, before magazines were all just going bankrupt. But back when Time could afford things like that. And, I had a 2-page picture of my face. I sent it to my mother, it was wonderful. But can you imagine being a CBT person, but suddenly this thing comes out? I titled the thing called "Happiness is Not Normal." And here's this person who you don't know very well. You kind of know he's there, but think he's kind of loony anyway. With his leathers and red eye, and the hero of CBT being called the Establishment. I'm sorry for the slow story, but just one other thing. John went, and of course, Tim's daughter is there to make sure, to kind of protect it a little bit. So the two of them are sitting there, Judith Beck, and he had to go 3 times, poking, before he could finally get Tim to say something stupid. And he was very careful not to, but he just finally got him to say, "The last time I heard about the third wave, it was about past life regression." That's what's in the Time story. I guess there was some Looney Toony thing years earlier where, the third wave was some sort of talking to ghosts or something.
Okay.
It has nothing to do with ACT. It has nothing to do with evidence-based therapy. It looks very ridiculous for a person at that level with their bow tie and knowledge, saying that, because this is a serious attempt. I mean, it may be wrong. That can be wrong, but it wasn't loony. Well, look a little loony. Anyway, so I had hell to pay. I'm sorry for the long story, but Stefan was one of the hell payers. He wrote "Old Wine in New Bottles." ACT is really just Morita therapy. The Steve Hayes doesn't really understand CBT. I mean, it was all there. But I invited him to come to a conference, and he started to realize that we were serious and that we had philosophical differences that were major. That takes some discussion. And they invited me to Germany, and I gave a talk at Berlin at the Behavior Therapy Association of Germany. And I fainted on stage because I had an arrhythmia. It turned out I had, this kind of fibrillation, AFib, that under a certain stress, when I cooled down, I'd start doing AFib. Well, I fainted on stage. They put me in the hospital. My heart rate's going. Who shows up by my bedside? Stefan Hofmann. When does he leave? 3 a.m. And we were talking. And I'm in a really scary thing. I'm having a heart attack. What's going on? Etc. I have a panic disorder. I know this is not a panic attack. I don't know what it is. It was AFib. They didn't find it out for a while. So I kind of came out of that saying, I don't care what people say about Stefan. Anybody who does that is on my Christmas list. This is a good man. And we started having arguments together on stage and having fun and debating and having fun. And pretty soon we're saying, really, we should research that, because it turns out he thinks about things in this very functional, very process-based way. Well, that's, I think that's cool. And that's really what I'm up to. All the way down to, geeky work on relational frame theory, a theory of cognition that is alive and well, hundreds of studies. It'll help your kids if they don't speak. It's pretty basic stuff. And so I'm sorry for the long answer. The short answer to the one that you asked is it's really a combination of Stefan's ideas and mine, and increasingly others. And I think what I brought to it was the sensitivity of a behavior analyst, Olive Skinner, who thought that Skinner didn't understand cognition and came up with a behavior analytic solution to the problem of cognition that wasn't hand-waving, but that was serious. And that I think is still what I'll be remembered for 100 years from now. It's not ACT, maybe PBT, but RFT, I predict it. Because I just think it's a very, very different approach to cognition that AI and big data and so forth are now discovering. Maybe they won't even know it's RFT. Maybe they'll just do it. But relational learning is the key to human cognition, in my opinion. And it's different. We're doing something different than the bird outside the window. I mean, probably 1 million years ago, the hominids figured it out, and Homo sapiens really nailed it. But what Stefan has brought is this radical, gutsy willingness to challenge the establishment while maintaining a relationship with a very high-level establishment figures. I mean, he's one of the best-known behavioral scientists in the world, and is a rising star by anybody's measure. And is not treated as other, because he really does understand some of the neuroscience of cognition or of consciousness, or the details of traditional research methodology in ways that I don't. I mean, I was trained as a single case design guy. I had to learn randomized trials later on after I got my PhD, et cetera, et cetera. So I brought some focus on high precision, high scope processes and strategic assumptions that have played well. And then some of the results of all that with flexibility processes and evolution. I brought an evolutionary model into PBT. But Stefan has brought the sophistication in terms of measurement and design, and how this thing can be turned maybe into something that practitioners can use.
We will come to the EAM hopefully, the extended evolutionary meta model. And I also noticed, and I think you wrote it in your learning process-based therapy book, that those 6 dimensions, or like the 6 processes from ACT, really map nicely onto those 6 dimensions of the EAM. There's one overlap that I noticed with ACT. Could you maybe speak a little bit about process-based therapy itself? What's the basic idea? What's the approach you're making? I mean, you say, for example, that there's no need for certain kinds of therapies anymore if we have process-based therapy, kind of like no umbrella, but it's not another kind of therapy. So, could you maybe talk a little bit about that? Yeah.
It's an approach to evidence-based therapy. So we say evidence-based therapy, EBT, without thinking that EBT is a specific technique. That's PBT. It's not a technique. It's like another way to say evidence-based therapy that is based on a certain set of ideas. That what needs to be evidence-based is the degree to which we can detect and modify biopsychosocial processes that promote positive change, or detect and modify the ones that promote negative change, and change those processes in such a way that they can have a positive impact. So there's still a need for models, because PBT, the idea is everybody can bring their models and processes in. We want you to measure them, and we want you to test them. And increasingly, we have ideas about measuring and testing them that probably are different than what you've been doing. Not conceptually, but strategically and methodologically, because we run into, in our 10-year journey on PBT, a severe problem in traditional research methodology that goes all the way back to Galton, of equating variability between people as if it means variability within people, and discovering that it doesn't, unless the phenomena is ergodic, and no processes of change are ergodic, and that it violates the mathematical assumptions of the methodologies themselves. So to come to the conclusion, basically, that 95% of psychological research is wrong, if you want to say it that way. I mean, it's really kind of thought that it's based on methodological and analytic assumptions that you can't meet. But as it applies to this idea that these data will apply to the developmental trajectories of individuals that I treat. Yeah. So put that aside for a minute, because it's complicated. Yeah. Given that you're going to still need models, something like ACT will still exist. Why? Because I've always said ACT is not a set of techniques. It's just a name for anybody who is trying to change and is held accountable to the change in psychological flexibility. That's a model. So the ACT model will exist. You can still call it ACT. I'm fine calling it that. But if you don't want to, we never cared about that. We've elected presidents of our society who call it mindfulness-based emotional intelligence training. We don't give an F. We don't care. We don't have a certificate. We're not trying to trademark it. We just, so. But even that, like, here's a model, has to be open to, well, okay, what is your model and what are your processes? And let's test to see which processes are best for this client, given this goal and this circumstances. And how would they best be changed in the context of a human being conceived of as a dynamical system, and in the context of an entire human being. When you say biopsychosocial, if you mean it, that means there's social processes, there's psychological processes, there's biological processes. We're not making firm distinctions. These are aspects of one thing. And so PBT asks you to measure and analyze sets of biopsychosocial processes that are sufficiently comprehensive that they could plausibly touch the major domains and dimensions of human functioning, and give you information that could lead to treatment, and then be held to account to the ability to change them and the outcomes. In other words, to be held to account to the treatment utility of the analysis. Now, it turns out when you do that, psychometrics is a problem, randomized controlled trials are a problem, traditional meta-analysis is a problem, mediational analysis is a problem. But before you get there, it really is busting down the walls in between all these different things and saying, let's have a conversation. We don't homogenize it. We want to say, I was using the example of your gumbo, throw a little bit of ACT in there. That'll make, what you do better. No, we don't want to do that. What we want to do is have you as a practitioner with the analytic tools and increasingly the training that would allow you to use whatever little kernels or methods put together in a coherent way could be of help to your client if they're targeting an empirically noted biopsychosocial process for that person. And we've given you guides for how to do it. I've got my liberated mind there, but there's another one. Yeah, learning process-based therapy. Not trying to sell books. I'm just saying we're trying to give the people the tools they need. And within about 6 months from now, you'll have the high density longitudinal app that will be able to collect and analyze the measures using these very new analytic methods we've come up with. Can I just say it a whole another way? We want to kill the DSM.
Yeah, beyond the DSM is another.
Drive a stake through that vampire's heart, and we want to place it with a modern version of functional analysis. That's PBT. The shortest way I could say it.
Yeah, maybe we can get back to, because I also have the book. I haven't really read it yet. Beyond the DSM, maybe how you or what the alternative may look like. But maybe let's stay a little bit with PBT. So I also heard you say or also read about the Death Star project, where I think it's the one where you like try to find out the mediators from effective therapy studies. And then you have I'm not sure if it's published now already, but you have like a preliminary version basically, and you have
the so-called Death Star project is published. It's in Behavior Research and Therapy. It's within the last 6 or 7 months. If you search on an odd word that we made up, you'll find it, because just in Google Scholar, there's only a few publications that have this odd word in the title. It's idionomic, IDIO from ideographic, and nomic from nomothetic. And just search on that word and it'll pop up in Behavior Research and Therapy. And what it was is a massive systematic review of all of the mediational studies ever done in any psychological intervention with either a TAU, treatment as usual, or waitlist control, and some active treatment that claims to have found a successful mediator of outcomes using properly done mediational analysis that has been replicated at least once. The measure, not the treatment, not the study, but the mediational measure has to have been shown up as significant in such a study at least twice in the world's literature. It took us 3 years to do it. It looked at almost 55,000 studies, rated each twice. 60 people worked on it so we know as of 2018, because it took so long to actually do it, what the most common mediators are in those 281 studies that have used measures that have been replicated at least once. And the bottom line is psychological flexibility and mindfulness accounts for 55% of everything we know, measured that way. And then it steps down. You have things, like reappraisal, etc. That's somewhere around 10%. You have things like the therapeutic alliance. It's about 3 or 4%. Because it keeps going down and getting smaller and smaller. We have shown that you can put all of the psychological mediators into the extended evolutionary meta model of thinking of the 6 psychological dimensions plus sociocultural and biophysiological ones, the 6 being emotion, cognition, attention, sense of self, motivation, and overt behavior, linked to efforts to create healthy change and to select and retain elements of healthy change that work in a given context. Those concepts are in there because that defines what evolutionary systems require: variation, selection, retention, and context. And so you can take a meta model and apply it to the entire world's mediational literature, and everything fits. With a couple, I'm not exactly sure, like there were 2 studies on personality, and it's hard to think of that as change exactly, because people don't think you can change personality. Which, how did it work as a mediator? I don't know, but there are 2 studies, so okay. So there was like 4 studies out of all of them that we weren't sure how to categorize it with the EAM, the extended evolutionary meta model. And psychological flexibility, pretty narrowly defined, counts for 55%. If you allow it to be flexible, like, for example, with cognition, I mentioned it earlier, you got diffusion. If you allow me to add reappraisal and new cognition, meaning cognitive flexibility, where you notice the cognitive variants that are healthy and helpful for you, and you work to retain them. If that can come in and still be thought of as a kind of psychological flexibility and like an extended definition, it's 83% of everything that we know about how change happens. And the only reason it's that small is the other ones are social cultural things. Be in a family that's supportive, have parenting that is supportive, therapeutic alliance, or biophysiological ones. Don't drink too much, make sure you can sleep, watch your diet, and a few brain function studies, brain circuits. So, and if you add those, it's 99%. So why don't we start targeting that instead of targeting the DS freaking M, which says in the beginning of the book, it doesn't have treatment utility. It says in writing, it doesn't tell you which treatment to pick. Well, what's it for then? To torture people? To let the bean counters pay your fees? I mean, what is it for? It's a joke, and it's a bad joke, and it needs to die.
It's encouraging to hear that it's so few, apparently, processes that account for so much variance. And I guess also what you're alluding to is if we have those few that account for so much, what's the point of diagnoses if they do account for several transdiagnostic problems, so
Yeah,
to
we're
speak?
so transdiagnostic. Transdiagnostic is too narrow a concept.
Mm-hmm.
So PBT says, okay, if that's it, and now we actually have done the meta-analysis, now true, with group designs with errors, and Stefan and I have published articles saying, we have to start doing ideographic mediational analysis, and exactly how to do that is still a wheel and spin. But when you're finished with that, well then, okay, now here's the set of processes. You can create measures that fit in there. You can use your own concepts. You don't have to call it diffusion. You can call it distancing. You can call it, cognitive awareness. You can call it reappraisal. I don't care. But, get in there so that we look at healthy variation, selection, retention at the cognitive level, emotional level, et cetera. Now, can we measure that longitudinally over time? In other words, can we characterize an individual based on what happens in their life with these biopsychosocial processes? The answer is yes, we can do that. It is a little demanding, but not that demanding. I just went on stage at the Evolution of Psychotherapy, a really big conference. It happens a couple of times, and once every few years. It was in Florida. And I had a very kind volunteer who gave me 3 times a day assessments, took 2.5 minutes per time. So less than 10 minutes a day for about a little more than 3 weeks. That's the only thing I knew about her. I got on stage and I showed the networks that came out of our new statistics that we're doing, some of which are really wild, haven't even been published yet, but they're very cool. And I could say to her, what I'm seeing in the data you shared is this. And she'd say, yeah, it's really like that. And here's an odd thing. And, it's like that. And I say, yeah, I do that. Like, for example, when this person who's struggling with not meeting her own needs because she's so busy trying to meet the needs of others. That was the thing she really wanted, of just being kind of the servant, the good girl at the cost of her own health and time and relationships and so forth. And so I'm showing this network and I say, you know what? Here's a place that happens where you kind of forget what your values are and you start getting wrapped up around, I have to be thought well of by others. The next thing you know, you're doing a lot of what you're complaining of. But I've noticed if you're doing something that's helping your health, it breaks you out of that pattern. What are you doing? So I have a yoga practice. Well, what do you do there? Well, I work on my mindfulness skills. I notice and just getting back in my physical body that helps me get more present. So then we start looking at the processes and the networks, and sure enough, there it's in there of, being more present, noticing your thoughts, remembering your values. She's already got it. She's doing it. But then sometimes, boom, she falls off and she's spinning into being the good girl and trying to get people to like her. And next thing you know, she's skipping her yoga practice. Mm. Is that a diagnosis? Well, before we started this train wreck called the DSM, the answer was yes. It was called functional analysis. Mm-hmm. That was evidence-based therapy. That was CBT. So let's go back to the future, but not with just direct tendencies or with, your father's version of cognitive therapy. Let's get into whatever the thing. I don't want to be critical of either one of those. I come out of Skinnerian nutrition. Not just that. I was well trained actually as an Ellisonian, one of the early Ellis REBT adopters. Not just that, but in the modern world, where we've got mindfulness in there, we've got a reappraisal in there, but thought of in different ways. We've got values in there. And let the functional analysis be the actual processes that lead to positive or negative outcomes for the clients as a system that can be perturbated to create a new system that leads to a path of progress. That's PBT. And if you've been doing ACT in a process-based way, you essentially have been doing a pilot test of PBT. What do you need to learn? You need to be more broad. You really do need some reappraisal training. You need some of that. You need to stop thinking just about accepting emotions, but also how to deepen them. And by the way, don't cling to the positive ones. It isn't just avoidance, it's also clinging. We know that. We didn't know that 5 years ago. So it's going to challenge clinicians to never settle and say, okay, I know it all now. No, you don't, because the science will keep moving. But meanwhile, I want to give tools to practicing clinicians that aren't these lies that we give them of here's the randomized trial with the smooth curves, and then they come in and their clients look like spaghetti. Well, that was always true. It's just the lying way that we do statistics that told clinicians it's supposed to look like those smooth curves. It doesn't look like those smooth curves. So that's going to be a fun thing of actually giving clinicians a science and data and tools and analyses that don't violate their assumptions, do apply to the individual, and will give you what functionally is a diagnosis, but it's not biomedicalizing human suffering.
You already mentioned it. Could you explain a little bit more the network approach? And I guess you would say it's fundamental. So you couldn't say, for example, well, I like the process-based therapy idea, but I'm not committing to the network approach. Or would you say that would still work?
Here's the problem. If we didn't know it before the last year or so, the PBT researchers now know it so much that they are having a hard time sleeping at night. That everything, underwrite the word everything, is wrong if you apply it to everybody. All models, all concepts, all measures, all principles underline the word everything. I'll give you an example. We have a piece that's under review, looking at self-compassion and compassion towards others. Why? Because they correlate. The kinder you are to yourself, the kinder you are to others. Mm-hmm. So if you have relationship problems, you should work on your self-kindness, self-compassion, because you're going to be able to be kinder to your mate, right? That's what the data show. The data are wrong. 3 out of 5 people, it's true. 1 out of 5, we're not sure. 1 out of 5, when we're following it graphically over time within their own life, and instead of turning people into error terms, but allowing variability within the person over time to be the only thing that we're looking at, and creating a network, 1 out of 5 people, the nicer they are to themselves, the meaner they are to others.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, that doesn't predict positive relationships nor a high quality of life. Those folks have created a variant of self-compassion that is selfish.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't play well. When you have your client in front of you who says, I got problems with my relationship, blah, 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 and you say, boy, I'm going to work on your self-compassion because you need to be, I can see that you're a little judgmental. What if you got one of those persons in front of you? And it turns out that in the network, part of what's going on there is that the person loses the perspective of the other person, and they lose contact with their social values having to do with their relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not true with all, but it is true with some. Some of those 1 out of 5s create this aberration, doesn't look right, but it plays that way, of selfish self-compassion, because it's being combined with other processes where the nicer you are to yourself, it turns into a kind of mindless self-indulgence.
Mm-hmm.
You take care of the kids, I got to go and meditate. You fix dinner, I got to take a bubble bath. I mean, it's all around you. If you look, you've got selfish mindfulness, you've got selfish self-acceptance. This is my ox being gored too. Understand that. All the flexibility processes. So we got into it because we realized that the ergodic theorem, this is a geeky thing, we may not want to get into it, but the ergodic theorem is accepted science in physics since the 1930s. It was created in the 1880s. And it says that you can go from the bell curves and standard deviations of a collective to predicting the trajectories of elements of a collective. They were looking at things like the behavior of molecules of gas and the volume of gas. These are physicists. If the phenomena doesn't change over time and all the elements are identical with the same dynamic model applying to them all. In other words, the same means and standard deviations for every molecule, and that volume of gas and all the spatial samples you do of that volume aren't showing you trajectories. If they show you trajectories, you can't apply normative stats to the development over time. And if the elements differ in the dynamic model, you can't. Well, do you think all human beings are identical? Well, maybe if you're treating and that they don't change over time. That would be if I'm treating a whole lot of frozen clones. If I'm not treating a lot of frozen clones, probably the answer is no. Okay, then here's the thing I have to tell you, my friends. Ergodicity is an assumption of all your traditional stats. You just didn't know it. There's an echo of it in the homogeneity assumption, but it turns out mathematically it requires ergodicity. And we've not been able to find consistently ergodic phenomena anywhere in the psychology literature. And the violations are usually not like over the edge. I mean, the violations on the order of 10 to 1,000 times beyond what ergodicity would require. So we're not going to be able to go from the bell curve to say, you need this process. How are we going to do it? We're going to have to analyze it idiographically and then match it into nomothetic templates or types if they don't blur the idiographic, but improve the idiographic fit. That's why we call it idionomic. And we've developed just over the last year 3 new statistical methods. The first one just is under review. I mentioned that article. And then one that has been out that I've talked about in a couple of articles called the Group Iterative Multiple Model Estimation Program, or GIMME, which the first person to notice that ergodicity applied to people, Peter Molinar, and one of his students, Katie Gates, came up with some years ago. So the world we're headed towards is one that is radically different. Empiric, if we're right. And so coming back to answer your question is no, you're not going to be able to do it without networks. And you have to go idiographic.
Yeah. But
you can
then,
get a taste of it without doing it, but you're not really doing it unless you do those things, because no process applies to everybody, and they always are dynamically linked to other processes.
And how is this research then looking like? Because I'm not sure what you're doing, but in the end, you will, as you say, no process is applying to everyone, etc. You will not have the conclusion, well, this is the process everyone needs, because it's just basically what you're saying. So, but what are you finding out then? Because in the end, if you have a patient, you always have to have like an individual network model for him or her, based, of course, on processes that are often at least in play. But how is it then? I'm just not understanding it right now, but I'm sure you have an answer. How is it
Well,
then
I think
more
what
precise, basically?
we're going to have to think of it like in the old days, in the early days of behavior therapy, places like the Maudsley out of the neo-behavioristic wing, or the behavior analysts, and what they were doing. They were doing idiographic analyses. They were creating measures, person by person. If you don't know that history and you're getting trained as CBT, you should know it, because it was the earliest phase, not just of behavior analysis, but of traditional behavior therapy, and of the early days of cognitive behavior therapy. Now, if what you're saying is, oh my goodness, what are we going to do if every individual is unique? Well, it's not the case that every individual is unique. Every individual is unique, but at the level of process, if we can feed it processes that are fundamental enough, basic enough, there's only, let me say it this way, I'll say it in kind of a simple way. There's only so many ways to get screwed up. It's a large number of ways, but there's only so many. And the reason why we did the Death Star project is we said, let's start with what we know at the group level, even though we know it doesn't apply to all individuals, and that ergodicity is being violated. So we can't just take mediational analysis and say, that's the functional important process for you. Can't do that. We're going to have to measure and look, but at least we'll do a rough sort. We've learned something over the last century, or half century, of doing all these randomized trials, especially from the ones where we had mediational studies. And by the way, one reason why there's so many psychological flexibility ones is the ACT people from the beginning, because we were process focused, did more mediational studies by far than traditional CBT. We just did it almost every single trial. And so some of that popularity, the 55%, might be just because we were early adopters. But that's okay, because we're going to apply it to individuals anyway. What I'm seeing here's what I'm seeing so far in this is that if you have a client who is willing to collect the measures, almost always I can give you very sensible clinical guidance that will make sense to you and to your client. In the book, we just describe how to do this just by talking to your client and putting up networks and saying, is this how it works? And they've lived it, and they can usually say, yeah, when I do this, then I do that. But they could be wrong. If we actually ask them repeatedly, how are things going over the last 3 hours? How are things going over the last 3 hours? Over and over again, or the last day, or however much the person can tolerate. We can put it now into the statistical procedures that will give you that. And there's a case study that we have out that did that with a client using Gimme. And it's really cool. It fits, what we did here, it fit, but the empirical analysis always added or subtracted something, because measurement beats clinical judgment every time. In the history of psychology, whenever you make that the race, measurement, actual empirical, does better than your best judgment. But we can get close. It isn't like the network didn't make any sense anymore. It was like, no, now we added, okay, your actual life as it's lived, there's some things you're not noticing. And I think if we can get enough people, we can then sort of template match. And how's our vision to get enough people? That's what I said. In about 6 months, you'll have the app. I intend for some of it to be free to use. Some of it, bells and whistles, you have to pay for it, because we have to pay for the dang thing. And where will the data go? The anonymized, de-identified data go to a charitable organization that I'm president of called the Institute for Better Health. And if we're lucky, a year from now or something, we'll have 500, 600, 1,000 people with high density longitudinal data. And then you get to start saying things like, okay, if you're struggling with anxiety, how many different ways are there to really getting screwed up with that? And I know experiential avoidance is going to be part of it, but for some people, no, it's not going to be at all part of it. It might even go in the opposite direction sometimes, like the case with self-compassion. So let's see. But it doesn't do any good for us to say, we got to hang on to what we've got. Friends, let me just say something. Your effect sizes aren't going up. Billions upon billions upon billions of dollars are being spent. And in fact, there's some recent data that over the last 10 years, they've gone down. Does that look like a successful science to you? You want to hang on to that?
Yeah, I really see the idea now, and also how valuable it is even on a like broader level to collect many single data of single individuals to still be able to say, let's say, well, 80% of the patients do in fact when they experiential avoid have X or Y as an negative outcome.
Yeah, we might be able to say, and of those where that's not true, 10% of them have this pattern, 10 of them have that pattern. Plus, we may give you the tools, say, if you can just get them to do it. And by the way, it won't necessarily have to be self-report. We have mediational analyses in the X space with coding the language that clients use in therapy in terms of flexibility processes. Well, that can be done automatically now. It isn't just that you can pull a dictation stream like you would a Zoom recording. You can actually score them. There's grants that have done this already with some of these flexibility processes, not to the point where you can access the tools, but I know the grants and I know who's involved with them. And it's not just that. Wearables. I can measure, are you with people or not? I can measure your heart rate variability. I can measure, so, and if we can create a context where there's enough data now, well, what we're doing with these new statistical tools, some of the things we're doing are essentially based on machine learning algorithms and the kinds of things that are kind of AI-like. And so wouldn't it be cool if you had kind of an assistant on your shoulder here as a therapist who could actually even be listening to your client's words, who knew the processes that were going on with your client, who would give you a little network that would suggest things, and that maybe could sort of hold your hand and say, based on the last couple of weeks, something is changing, especially over here for the good, but it's not yet stable. It's doing this flickering thing they call in network analysis. Instead of having the assistant on your shoulder say, what are the 5 out of 9 symptoms of major depression, when you know that the last big randomized trial of major depression, multi-site, out of 3,700 people, there was 1,000 different combinations of signs and symptoms. And almost half had a combination that was so rare that only 5 other people shared it. I mean, does that sound simplifying to you? 3,700 people, almost half of them have a combination that only 5 other people share. You're going to have to remember. You're going to have to memorize 1,000 different things then. You can't do that. But maybe we can give you the tools that will focus on what's important. And then you use your clinical creativity, and you can look at the data on what processes are moved most by which kernels or elements. But you can also try things out yourself. And if you try it out and it moves, and what it moves is evidence-based processes that are reliably predictive of outcomes as part of a network that applies to this person, how is that not evidence-based therapy? I mean, if I had somebody coming in to see me who's bashing their head over with a skull with a rubber hammer, and and they're complaining of a headache, I might say, really, we got to work on hitting your head with that hammer. Not, and if I can get the hammering to stop, I will have considered that I've done evidence-based therapy. Wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We can do that. It doesn't have to be one-size-fits-all protocols shoved into cubby holes called syndromes
Yeah.
that dehumanizes people and violates its own assumptions.
I also like that you are using the new tools like EMA studies and network analysis and machine learning, etc. And I'm very excited to see how it will continue. Do we have a couple more minutes or
Sure. I can take a few more. Yeah.
okay, cool. Thank you. So, um, yeah, maybe coming to an end still, could you talk a little bit more about the EAM? Because I think it's very interesting. Also, like you touched upon it already, but the variation, selection, retention, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah, just talk a little bit about the model, please. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing is that I always say if you take anybody in the life sciences other than psychiatry and psychology, mental health, any other area, pick it. You're a cardiologist, you're a pulmonologist, anyway. Go in and whatever conversation you have, catch something they say about you and say, well, why is it like that? And whatever they say, catch what they say and say, well, why is it like that? And whatever else they say, I bet you within 3 questions, you're going to hear the word evolution.
Mm.
They're going to say that it evolved that way. The only life scientists and practitioners that you can talk from now until next Tuesday and the E word will never be said are psychology and psychiatry.
Mm.
Time's up, gang. I mean, the queen of the life sciences theory-wise is evolution. Now, the problem is evolution went through a gene-centric era, which was false. It is not empirically correct, and it was not conceptually correct. The modern synthesis assumes things that we now know are not true. Genes don't directly code for proteins. They don't. Only as part of a system, part
Mm.
of an entire system. And by the way, environment and behavior are ways that cells have cells have systems for turning environment and behavior into biology with things like epigenetics. And we know even some of this epigenetic regulation of your genome is a massive part of your genome. Not that the epigenetics are on the genome, but that system is regulated by a massive part of your genome. And even that your epigenetic responsivity has intergenerational transmission through epigenetics to a degree, and also leads to genetic accommodation in experimental analyses with flies and other things that reproduce fast enough that you can ask the question across generations. Exactly how, they're still working out. But and that's just one level. So what other levels? Well, how about culture? And we know that cultures evolve. All evolutionists agree on that. The only reason that they don't say, and so do you, is because they've been thinking of retention only in terms of
Mm.
life and death. Some forms of retention occur only within a particular context. So your behavior is retained within your life, but it doesn't go past your life unless it passes into the lives of others, which, by the way, it does. That's family traditions,
Mm.
culture, etc. Not just that. It does through epigenetics. So you need to think of evolution in a modern way, which is multi-level. Multi-level selection came back from the ash heap of evolution, and my colleague David Sloan Wilson is the
Mm.
single most important person in that, but he's not the only one. And uh, Lamarck to some degree was right. He didn't know about genes. Darwin didn't know about genes. But so let's think about it in a multi-level way, but also a multi-dimensional way. Why? Because evolution is part of a system, and that you make many, many, many examples if you try to apply evolution without it. I'll give you a classic example that nobody would question. You want to have birds that are cage raised, lay a lot of eggs because you want to sell them? Here's a good idea. Take the hens that lay a lot of eggs and allow them to reproduce. Good idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Any applied evolutionists would say this. No, they wouldn't. Not if they're multi-level thinkers. If they're cage-raised birds, they're in a cage with other birds. Do you think that's part of it? Well, let's see. Okay, how about if we take the cages that produce the most eggs, and even if of the 9 hens, let's say they're in that cage, one of them doesn't lay any eggs at all, and we let them all reproduce. We'll run this experiment. We'll go after over 6 generations. Which one lays the most eggs? By massive amounts. It's allowing all the hens in the cage, whether they lay eggs or not, if the cage is productive, to reproduce. What do you get if you only let the birds that are laying a lot of eggs reproduce? After 6 generations, your egg production has fallen massively. Why? Because they peck each other from morning till night. In a cage of 9 birds, only 3 or 4 will live. They won't have any feathers, because what you did is you picked the baddest, meanest birds that knew how to get the most food when you started. You thought you were picking egg laying. No, you weren't. You were picking aggressive food grabbers. How do they do that? They peck the other birds to stay away from the tree, and they get there first and they have their fill. 6 generations, they don't look like egg layers. They are badass birds. How do you know beforehand what you're doing when you say, oh, well, just, this is why eugenics was always a bad science. I mean, evolution went to applied evolution in 10 years. Darwin published his Origins. 10 years later, his cousin, same grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, Francis Galton, published his Hereditary Genius, where we got nature, nurture, raw G, intelligence is genetic. Thank you very much, Francis. And therefore, we ought to only be breeding smart, white, upper class, rich UK dudes. And for God's sake, keep the Jews out. My relatives died because of that. I'm Jewish by the maternal line. And it wasn't just him, it was Pearson with the pogroms, and then when Fisher during the Second World War, keep them out. And it wasn't just the Jews, it was Black people and Native Americans anyway. So here's what I'm saying. We need to bring an applied evolution science to the table that is worthy of the name. The early attempts to do it were such a train wreck that it traumatized the entire world culture. But we haven't stopped using the tools that Galton created, and his fellows. Ari Fisher was he professor of, not of statistics, not of mathematics, it was of eugenics. At the University College London, Carl Pearson, he was eugenics, Frank Yates, eugenics. So we were using these tools, and we have such a bad example that we're going to have to push the restart button, because the world needs an applied evolutionary science, and clinical work has always been that. We have names for variation, selection, retention. Variation, change. Selection, success. Retention, maintenance. We just haven't thought of ourselves as being multi-level, multi-dimensional evolutionists, but we are. So let's not be bad ones. Let's not be the functional equivalent of the genes made me do it. That train wreck happened once. We're still suffering as a world culture because of it. Tomorrow is National Holocaust Day. And let that be a little bit of remembrance to, yes, to applied evolution, but not to that version. We need one that is driven by human values, that is sensitive to these ergodic problems, and that will help people evolve on purpose and help cultures evolve on purpose in ways that are controlled by the values of everybody, and not the creator or the master race or whatever it is that we live through with authoritarian versions, either on the right or the left. The eugenicists were on the right and the left, you know, and I'm spending a lot of my time trying to understand it because process-based therapy took me there, and I'm finding that 2/3 of the presidents of the American Psychological Association from 1892 when it started to 1947 were eugenicists. 2/3. And nobody talks about it. And it's a dirty, awful history. So extended evolutionary meta model is an attempt to help us create an applied evolutionary science inside the behavioral sciences that is multidimensional and multi-level, and that can be guided by human values in a way that makes it safe.
Yeah, I also like that in the learning process-based therapy book that you can use it as a grid and then start constructing the network based on the dimensions and levels. And then also with the client, as you said already, trying to see and also try remembering to not forget some processes maybe that are on a certain dimension you didn't really think about. And if you know you have all those dimensions,
the practical utility of the EAM, the single biggest practical utility is make sure that you get the rows covered. If you have a model that never talks about attention, think about attention, because we know that it's important. And you can add other things to it, you know, and these are soft distinctions in the rows. This is the way to orient your things. So the comprehensiveness of it, and then across the columns, which is variation, selection, retention, and context, that context thing reminds you that nothing works for anyone everywhere. So it isn't just that nothing, you know, everything is has to be thought of in terms of the individual. Within the individual has to be thought of in terms of the context. I mean, there's a time to be selfish. There's a time to be angry. There's a time to be, you know, all of those things have a. So it, and then the variation, selection, retention. Well, you know, usually variation we're pretty good at. We're thinking a lot about how to get change, but we sometimes haven't really thought about how to catch the winners and notice them, and maybe get the people we work with to notice them, because they're waiting for an overall outcome, an overall goal. But what they have to catch is something like, you know, that moment, I actually did this. Now, a good clinician does that. That thing you just did where I raised an issue and you actually leaned forward and said something. I've never seen you do that here. And when you first came in, I would, you know, your eyes would close, and next thing you know, the topic would be changed. So something's happening. You know what I'm talking about, where you catch your client's progress because you've been watching them intensively. You can see these little micro moments. That's a step forward. That's cool. If you can get your clients to do it, well, then retention, everything we know about psychology, it has to do with broaden and build. You got to repeat it, and you got to put it into larger patterns, so that even when you go mindless, it's still happening. So we can build an applied evolutionary science that applies to psychotherapy without a big change in our current theories and stuff. We're already doing it. We just need the measures and the data analyses to help guide us as to when we're doing it well.
Yeah. Very, very interesting, I have to say. So my last official question is, if you could not predict, but go into the future of say 50 years, and what would you like psychology and therapy books, what would you like them to write about PBT, and maybe also about yourself?
Oh golly, I never really ever answered that question, oddly enough. I do the second part, but the first part, I think I have a sense. You know, a behavioral science has been put to the side over and over and over again when it's needed. If somebody's going to show a thing on the television about climate change tonight, I can almost guarantee you there will be no psychologist on that screen. There'll be physical scientists, policymakers, politicians, lawyers, economists, not psychologists. My first book was called Environmental Problems, Behavioral Solutions. I was an environmentalist. And this was almost 50 years ago. It's still in print because there's so few books on it. It's pathetic. But I left it because I just realized nobody cares. Nobody's going to let me do this. But I would hope 50 years from now that people are used to having behavioral scientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc., as part of our world of evolving a more compassionate, values-based, and humane and kind human culture, economically, politically, socially, uh, emotionally, educationally, and so forth. And to not do it by, Herr Professor says this is the solution. I mean, I'm not talking about making the psychologists the experts. We have to up our game hugely to be able to play this way, we being the behavioral scientists. That would include the things that we call behavioral disorders. But I hope 50 years from now, we're wise enough not to create a clown suit and invite people to crawl into it and never be able to leave. Where people come in and the first sentence they want to tell you as a client is all the things they have, which are these made up disorders that even children are learning to, I have this and I have this and I have this and I have that. Doesn't tell them what to do, doesn't empower them, doesn't, they do the list. And then next thing you know, you're into accommodations that will keep people in that unit forever, et cetera, et cetera. I hope in terms of me, I have spent my life trying to bring a functional contextual tradition that starts with James and Darwin before him and is there with Skinner and some of the heroes that I had as a student. And I would like to see that stream I'd be thought of as a person to help bring that stream back into the mainstream of behavioral science and of the world in a way that it was safe and useful to listen, and in a way that really paid off. I became a behaviorist because I read Walden too. And it wasn't because I believed I was a hippie, and I lived on a commune and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't because I thought Walden 2 was the answer. Skinner didn't think it was the answer. He wrote a utopian novel to say this is the kind of thing psychology should be concerned with. How do we raise our children? How do we create relationships that are meaningful? What are we going to do when we do have a lot of time? If it plays out right with AI and all the rest, we will have robots doing our physical work. Do you doubt it 50 years from now? I don't doubt it for a second. Of course they will. Is there going to be controlled just by a megalopolis of, ultra-rich billionaires? I hope not. I hope we're wise enough that the democracies at least will say, cool, let's create a world in which we get to really do deep dives into art and poetry and literature and science and all the rest of that. Read Walden 2, and you'll see there's this aspiration, if we could manage our resources, in which nobody's hungry, in which, criminality is managed and abuse is much less common, and on it goes. That utopian vision imposed on people is a horror. As a vision for us as a human community, how do we create a kinder, more effective, more supportive world where people don't starve and the wars don't happen? Why shouldn't we dream about that? So I hope somehow, if it all works out in such a way that it unfolds, then maybe I get a footnote somewhere that I, along with many, many, many others, we're trying to figure out a way to build a world in which we can evolve on purpose. Not in that creepy master race way of having the right genes, but no, as a life form that took responsibility for its own behavior and its impact on other creatures, species that depend on their survival, both our kindness and on the planet itself. That whole planet, whole world ethic that I think is built into our hearts as the social primates that we are. And we've invented really wonderful things: language, science, art, literature, dance, etc. We've invented those. Let's bring it. And I don't think you're going to find that in the 50 years from now in what will be DSM 15.
Yeah, I'm sure you will be more than just a footnote, be it for ACT, PBT, or as you earlier said, RFT, which I unfortunately haven't had the let's say time to delve into. But yeah, for me it wasn't really an honor to talk to you, because for me it's pretty clear that you will be one of the top clinical psychologists of all time. But so yeah, again, for me it was a great honor, and thank you so much also for taking a lot of time of your schedule. Yeah, I hope it was fine for you too.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. And for those listening, can I just say, if there's something I've said here that interests you and you want to find out more about psychological flexibility and so forth, as you said right at the beginning, there's so much on the internet you can get. The World Health Organization distributes free ACT self-help in cartoon book versions, and audio tapes. I mean, you don't even have to buy a $12 self-help book. It's at that level. And if you want to, for some reason, if you're just interested in following my work, go to my website. It's just my name, www.stephenchayes, all one word, no periods, Stephen with a V, C for Charlie, Hayes, and click on yes, please send it to me, and I'll send you a newsletter once a month. I don't spam people, and if you ever don't like it, it's one click and it goes away. But and if not me, if there's something I said that interests you, you'll find that there's a lot of folks out there who are ready to be of use to you. And we have a tradition of kind of giving it away. And so if you want to use things in your work or modify or change or build or whatever, you'll find a community in the contextual behavioral science community, if you're a professional, which is contextualscience.org. 9,000 people around the world, 47 chapters, 18 different languages. There's folks probably not too far from where you are who are also interested. So you can find folks to play with.
All right. I will also make sure to put some links in the description of the video.
Sure.
So again, thank you so much, and yeah, have a good run. And good luck with PBT, and I'm closely following it.
Awesome. Yeah. Help us out. We need it.
Okay, let me try to sum up some of the key ideas of process-based therapy. So the idea, as I see it, is that you can do certain things as a therapist or in therapy, or indeed also for yourself, that will lead to some good outcomes like well-being or just less stress with some problems, and like alleviating some of the symptoms. And what's happening in between are those processes, those that are actually doing the change, basically. And I will show you just a list of, first I want to show you a list of the 19 treatment kernels that Hayes and Hofmann have listed in their books. And as you can see, that are just the main interventions that therapists use from all of the three waves, as we call them in therapy. So the first wave was the wave with the behavior therapies, which brought to the table things like stimulus control, contingency management, behavioral activation, etc. Then the cognitive wave, the second wave with modifying core beliefs, for example, or cognitive reappraisal. And then also treatment kernels from the third wave, acceptance, mindfulness, and so on. And yeah, I think it's a very nice modular approach here to have all those kind of treatment kernels as tools, especially for me as a becoming therapist. That's very neat. And then we try to target the processes, and here we have a list of we were talking about the top mediators, which are at least candidate processes of change. And here you can see something interesting, and I forgot to ask him about that, but for example, acceptance and cognitive reappraisal are both listed as treatment kernels and processes. And I think, if I understand it correctly, the idea is that as a therapist, for example, you try to or let's say you encourage a patient, for example, to go out in a difficult situation and try to accept the emotions that will be arising in the situation. And by kind of getting the patient to do that is kind of like a treatment intervention based on acceptance, like an acceptance intervention, let's say. And then, of course, if the patient goes in there with a behavioral process going into difficult situations, and also psychological process of actually trying to accept those emotions when they arise, of course, this is then the mechanistic process going on. So I think it's no contradiction to have things like acceptance on both the treatment kernel side and the process side. And yeah, I think it's just very, very neat also to have those dimensions. And as you can see, you already have the processes, and also, as you can see, you have the dimensions of the EAM, the extended evolutionary meta model, and which is also, I think, very nice, because as a therapist you can really see, okay, those are the different dimensions I can like work on. And if I have a patient, it's not, of course, not that each patient has problems in each of those dimensions, but rather you should, I think you should see what are the really important dimensions, and then of course the really important processes for that individual patient. And of course you can also use this for yourself, because yeah, everyone has some problems, and treatment methods and interventions don't just work for patients, of course. So also for me personally, I think it's very nice. It's a big picture on like how I can intervene on certain things if I have a problem. And yeah, also the network approach I think is very helpful, because you can use this grid of EAM to try to come up with important elements for your little network, or indeed of that of a patient, and see what is he or she actually doing regarding this whole system of, let's say, problem. What is he feeling, what is he thinking, and what leads to what? And then you can probe the system, as they call it, try to see, if that's the theory, I think this will lead to this, for example, so let's try to change A. Let's see how it really influences B as we are thinking. And then you have this feedback system and dynamic system, hopefully really supported by those technological things like those apps, etc. And yeah, I think it's a very, very nice big picture idea of therapy, with the best treatment interventions that have been out there for 20, 30, 40, some maybe even 100 or thousands of years, and the processes that you can target. Both for a therapist, it's very, very nice to have all of this in front of you, and also for the patients, I think it will be very helpful also for like psychoeducation, to explain to them what we are actually doing, and to see how if the network can be changed in a better way. Yeah, I hope you had some fun during this conversation and got one or two little insights with you, and yeah, I see you in the next one.